The handcuffs clicked onto my wrists in front of 37 people, my family, my neighbors, my kids' friends, while my daughter's graduation balloons were still tied to the fence posts, bobbing in the June breeze like nothing in the world was wrong. I had just flipped the last rack of ribs. The charcoal was still glowing. And Officer Derek Price, badge number 4471, was telling me to calm down and stop resisting, even though I hadn't moved a single muscle since he'd grabbed my arm. I want you to understand something before we get to how all of this ended. I spent 4 years in Iraq and 3 in Afghanistan. I know what it feels like to be looked at like you're the threat in a room. But I never thought I'd feel that way standing in my own backyard. But let me go back to the beginning, because the morning of that Saturday started the way all my best Saturdays do, with the smell of hickory smoke and my wife Denise's laughter coming through the kitchen window. I'd been up since 6, not because I had to be. I've been retired from active duty for 4 years now, working as a logistics consultant for a private firm downtown, and Saturdays are mine to do with as I please. But old habits don't die just because you trade combat boots for slide sandals. My body still woke at dawn, still cataloged the sounds of the house the way it had once cataloged the sounds of a forward operating base. The creak of the third stair meant Denise was up. The muffled TV from upstairs meant my son Jordan, 17, was already deep in whatever game he'd stayed up too late playing. The silence from the end of the hall meant my daughter Aaliyah, 22, was sleeping in after driving 7 hours from Atlanta the night before, diploma still in her trunk, exhausted and happy. I stood at the back porch rail with my coffee, black, no sugar, same as it's been for 22 years, and looked out at the yard. I'd mowed it the day before. The long folding tables were already set up along the fence, covered in the good tablecloths Denise bought specifically for this occasion. We'd strung lights between the oak trees, and in the morning they looked faded and ordinary, but by evening they'd turned the backyard into something soft and golden. I'd been planning this cookout for 3 weeks. Aaliyah's graduation party, delayed because she had finals to finish, and then a week of celebrations with her college friends. But now she was home, and we were doing it right. Denise came out with her second cup of coffee and leaned against me, tucking herself under my arm. She smelled like her vanilla lotion in the kitchen, onions and brown sugar, probably already working on the baked beans. 40 people confirmed, she said, satisfied watching me poke at the grill. 42, I said. Marcus Jr. texted last night. He's bringing his girlfriend. She made a noise somewhere between pleased and exasperated. That boy. Fine. I'll stretch the potato salad. I kissed the top of her head. 24 years married, and she still made the morning feel like something worth waking up for. I thought about that a lot during the deployments. Not the big dramatic thoughts, not the flag and country speeches I'd given myself before. Just this. Denise at dawn, leaning against me, talking about potato salad. That was the thing I was fighting to get back to. That was the thing I'd always come home for. The guests started arriving around noon. My brother Calvin and his wife Patricia drove up from Baltimore, pulling in with a trunk full of folding chairs and a cooler of drinks they'd bought on the way. My old army buddy Terrence showed up shortly after, his wife and 3 kids in tow, the youngest one, a girl named Bria, making a beeline for our dog the second she got through the gate. My neighbors, the Washingtons from 3 doors down, brought their famous rum cake. Denise's co-workers from the school district filled 2 rows of chairs by themselves. Aaliyah's childhood friends, some of whom I'd watched grow from gap-toothed 10-year-olds into confident, beautiful young women, clustered around the back porch in their summer dresses, laughing at things on their phones and then looking up to laugh at each other. It was loud and warm and exactly what I wanted. I was at the grill most of the day. That's where you'll find me at any cookout. I don't trust anyone else with the meat. I had 4 racks of ribs going, 2 briskets wrapped in foil, chicken thighs marinated since Thursday, and a separate section for the sausages and corn. Terrence stood beside me for most of the afternoon, cold beer in hand, narrating my cooking process to anyone who'd listen like he was the announcer at a championship game. "Watch this man work," he announced to no one in particular, gesturing grandly at the grill. 26 years of military discipline, and he applies all of it to the smoke ring on those ribs. "Go sit down," I told him, and he laughed the way he always has. Big, full body, shoulders shaking, and didn't move an inch. I noticed Ted Garland for the first time around 2 o'clock. He lived directly behind us, separated by a wooden fence. We'd been neighbors for 6 years, and in that time, I'd come to understand that Ted Garland was the kind of man who built his entire identity around the fiction that he was the right sort of person, in the right sort of neighborhood, maintaining the right sort of standards. He was 58, retired early from some kind of financial work, and spent a lot of his time either trimming his hedges or standing at his back window. I'd seen him, more than once, watching our yard from behind the glass. Denise said I was being paranoid. I had spent too many years reading situations to dismiss my own instincts, but I tried. I told myself he was just a bored man, harmless, ordinary. The first time I'd actually spoken to him was about a year after we moved in. He'd come to the fence to complain about Jordan's basketball hoop being too visible from his property, which it wasn't. It was in the middle of our driveway, not even close to the fence line. I'd been polite, civil. I'd smiled and said I'd take a look, knowing full well there was nothing to take a look at. He'd gone away satisfied, and I'd stood there for a long moment afterward, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not anger, something more like a cold, careful recognition. At 2 o'clock, I glanced up from the grill and saw him standing at his back window, looking out at our yard. 30-something people laughing, kids running, music playing, nothing out of the ordinary for a weekend cookout. But his expression was flat and still in a way that prickled at the back of my neck. I held his gaze for a second. He didn't look away. I turned back to the grill. "You all right?" Terrence asked quietly, the way soldiers ask when they've read something in your posture. "Fine," I said. "Flip those sausages." By 4 o'clock, the yard was at capacity. Aaliyah had changed into a yellow sundress and was in the middle of the yard holding court with her friends and her aunts simultaneously, managing both conversations with the ease that had always made me proud of her. Jordan was running around with Bria and a few of the other kids. Denise and Patricia were at the big table with the older women, deep into the kind of conversation that would go on until well after dark. My brother Calvin was telling some exaggerated story that had the men around him doubled over. I was happy. I just pulled the first rack of ribs off the grill, finished, perfect, the bark a deep mahogany, the smoke ring exactly right, and set them on the cutting board to rest. I was wiping my hands on my apron when I heard the side gate open. I looked up. 2 police officers walked into my backyard. The first one I didn't recognize. Younger, maybe late 20s, hanging back slightly near the gate. The second one was Officer Derek Price. I knew him by sight because he'd once responded to a fender bender 2 blocks over and stood in the street talking to the other driver, a white man, for 20 minutes, while the car I was driving sat parked nearby, unacknowledged, invisible. I'd filed that away. I file everything away. Price was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of square jaw that made him look permanently skeptical. He walked into my yard like he'd been invited, scanning the crowd with eyes that moved too fast and settled too quickly. The music didn't stop. Not immediately. A few people near the gate turned to look. Most of the yard was still oblivious. "Sir," Price said, looking at me, "we received a noise complaint." I set down my tongs, slowly, deliberately. I was aware of my body in a way I hadn't been since the army, aware of my hands, my posture, my face. I kept my voice level and my expression neutral. "Good afternoon, officer," I said. "This is a private residence. I'm Marcus Webb. I own this property. Noise complaint was called in at 3:47, he said as if I hadn't spoken. His eyes moved over the crowd, then came back to me. "Can you turn the music down?" "Of course," I said and nodded to Jordan, who was close enough to hear. My son looked at me for a second, and I saw it, that flicker, the thing no black father wants to see in his child's eyes, that quick recalibration of the world. And then he went to the Bluetooth speaker and turned the volume down. Silence settled over parts of the yard. More people had noticed now. Terrence had moved slightly closer, not obviously, just a degree or two, the way soldiers close ranks. "Is there anything else?" I asked. Price looked at me for a long moment. "You got a permit for this gathering?" The cold started at the base of my spine. "It's a private party on private property," I said, still calm. "There's no permit required." "How many people you got here?" "Officer?" I don't believe I'm required to answer that. And that was it. That was the moment his jaw tightened. That was the moment his hand moved. Not to his weapon, not yet, just to his belt, a territorial adjustment. And his eyes went flat. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over here with me." "I'm not going to do that," I said. "I'm standing at my own grill, in my own backyard, hosting a legal private event. If you have a specific concern, I'm happy to address it. But I'm not going to step aside because you're uncomfortable." What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds. He moved toward me. I didn't step back, not because I was trying to escalate, but because stepping back on my own property, in front of my family, in front of my daughter's graduation party, felt like something I could not do. His hand closed around my upper arm. I did not resist. I did not pull away. I went completely still, the way they train you to go still when you're trying not to make a bad situation worse. The handcuffs clicked shut. "You're being detained," Price said. The music had stopped completely now. Every single person in the yard was looking at us. Aaliyah had gone pale under her warm brown skin. Denise was already moving toward us, and I watched, still completely still, completely silent, as my brother Calvin stepped in front of her, not to stop her, but to be her first line of words, because Calvin had always been better at that than I was. My dog tags were under my shirt. I'd worn them out of habit, the way I always do, the cool metal weight of them against my sternum. I thought about them in that moment, about the service number stamped into them, about the 2 theaters of combat they represented, about the years they'd hung around my neck in places where the decision to keep them meant something. I thought about all of that, standing handcuffed at my own grill, smelling my own smoke, while my daughter's graduation balloons bobbed in the June breeze. I thought, this is not over. "Officer," Calvin said, stepping forward, voice measured and careful, hands visible, "can you tell us specifically what my brother is being detained for?" "Sir, I need you to step back." "I'm a retired attorney," Calvin said, which was not entirely accurate. He'd been a paralegal for 15 years and knew enough law to be dangerous. "And I'm asking you a specific legal question. What is the basis for this detention?" Price looked at him with the expression of a man who had expected compliance and was recalculating. I stood completely still. 37 people watched. And somewhere, at the far end of the yard, Terrence's wife had already taken out her phone. Price didn't answer Calvin right away. He stood there with that square jaw set and his hands still near his belt, doing the math. How many cameras, how many witnesses, how much he'd already committed to. I watched him do it. I've seen that calculation on other faces in other places, on men who had just realized they'd walked into something they hadn't fully thought through. The difference was that those men were usually armed with something more than a badge. "The basis," Price said finally, his voice taking on a slow, deliberate quality, like he was choosing each word from a rack, "is that the individual was uncooperative during a lawful investigation." "What investigation?" Calvin pressed, and his voice was still calm, still lawyer-measured, still a man who knew the terrain. A noise complaint is not an investigation, and uncooperative is not a crime. So I'll ask you one more time. What specific charge justifies placing handcuffs on my brother in his own home? The younger officer, whose name tag read Miller, shifted his weight near the gate. I noticed him glance sideways at Price, a quick, private thing, something uncertain in it. I filed that away too. Price looked at me. "Sir, are you going to calm down?" "I am calm," I said. And I was. That was the thing he couldn't account for, the thing that seemed to irritate him more than anything else. I was not shouting. I was not crying. I was not performing fear for his benefit. I was standing in my own yard, hands cuffed behind my back, and I was completely, absolutely calm. Not the calm of a man who has given up. The calm of a man who is paying very close attention. "He's calm," Denise said from behind Calvin, her voice tight and controlled the way it gets when she is working very hard to keep herself from becoming something that can't be walked back. "He has been calm this entire time. My husband has been calm. What has he done that justifies this? Ma'am, I need you to..." "Don't you ma'am me," she said, and something in her tone made even Calvin go still for a half-second. Denise is a soft-spoken woman, a school administrator who has spent 20 years talking children and parents and school board members through difficult things. But there is a register she can reach, a particular frequency of quiet fury that makes the air change. Don't you stand in my yard and tell me to settle down when my husband is handcuffed for grilling food. Don't you do that. Price's jaw tightened further. He turned to Miller. "Call it in." "Call what in?" Calvin asked. "What are you calling in?" I heard Aaliyah's voice from somewhere behind me. Not words, just a sound, sharp and short, the sound of someone who has just understood something they were hoping not to understand. My daughter. 22 years old, first-generation college graduate, still wearing her yellow sundress from her own celebration party. I could not turn to look at her because I didn't trust what would happen to my face if I did. What I did instead was look at Ted Garland's back fence. He was no longer at his window. He had moved. He was standing in his backyard now, just on the other side of the wooden slats, visible through a gap, watching. Not with the expression of a man who had called the police and was worried about what happened next. With the expression of a man watching something he had expected and was satisfied by. That was when the cold in my spine turned into something else entirely. Not anger. Something colder and more useful than anger. Price uncuffed me 12 minutes later. He did it without apology, without explanation, with the practiced neutrality of a man wrapping up paperwork. Miller had gotten on the radio, and something had come back that changed the calculus. I found out later it was a duty supervisor who'd been listening to Calvin's very precise recitation of the relevant statutes and decided the whole thing needed to stop before it got any more documented. The cuffs came off. Price handed me a card with a case number for the incident report and told me to have a nice evening. He walked out the same gate he'd walked in through. The silence in my backyard lasted perhaps 5 seconds after that gate closed. Then Terrence's wife, whose name is Rochelle and who had been recording on her phone for 11 of those 12 minutes, lowered her arm and looked at me. "I got all of it," she said quietly. "Good," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Calvin was already on his phone. Aaliyah was crying, not loudly, but steadily, the tears just falling. And that was somehow worse than if she'd been sobbing. Jordan was standing very still near the Bluetooth speaker, 17 years old and trying to look like he hadn't been terrified. Denise walked up to me and put both her hands flat on my chest, over where the dog tags were, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since the airport, 4 years ago, when I came back from my last deployment. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm okay," I said. She held my gaze another second, checking. Then she exhaled and turned toward the yard. "Let's eat," she said to everyone and no one in the tone of a woman who has decided that the best act of defiance available to her right now is to continue the party. And the remarkable thing, the thing I still think about, is that people listened. The music came back on, low at first. Food started moving. Kids started running again. It wasn't like nothing had happened. You could feel the weight of it in the way people talked. Quieter, closer together. People checking on each other. But they stayed. They ate. They sang happy birthday to Aaliyah, even though it wasn't her birthday, because someone decided to, and everyone else followed. I stood at the grill for another hour and finished cooking everything I had left to cook, because that was what I could do right then, and it mattered that I did it. But the whole time, I was thinking. Rochelle's video went up that night. She posted it on her personal accounts around 9 o'clock, after the guests had left and the yard was quiet and the kids were inside. She texted me to say it was up. By midnight, it had been shared 1,100 times. By 6 the next morning, my phone was ringing with numbers I didn't recognize, and the video had 200,000 views and a news chyron on 3 different networks. I don't think I slept more than 40 minutes that night. I lay on top of the covers next to Denise. She was out cold. The deep, unguarded sleep of a woman who had held herself together for 7 hours and finally let go. And I stared at the ceiling and let myself think about things I'd been too carefully disciplined to think about during the party, about what it meant that Price had walked into my yard the way he did, about the specific texture of his certainty, the way he'd moved like a man who'd done this before and expected the same result, about Ted Garland's face at the fence, that satisfied, settled look. I got up at 4. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark and opened my laptop. It took me less than an hour to find 2 other incidents. The first was a Facebook post from 8 months ago. A woman named Diane Morton who described a remarkably similar encounter. Officers responding to a noise complaint at a backyard gathering, escalation, brief detention, no charges. She lived 4 miles away. The responding officer's name was not in her post, but she'd tagged the precinct, and in the comments someone had replied with a name. Price. The second was a community board thread from 2 years ago. A man named Robert Ellison had filed a formal complaint with the department after he and his brother were detained at a block party. His complaint had been reviewed and dismissed as unsubstantiated. The name of the reviewing officer was in the administrative response letter he'd scanned and uploaded. Sergeant T. Price. I sat with that for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping through the kitchen window, and then gone. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and felt the warmth and thought about patterns, about the difference between a man who makes a mistake and a man who has a practice, about the difference between an incident and a system. I reached into the collar of my shirt and pulled out my dog tags, held them in my palm in the dark. There's a weight to them that's disproportionate to their size. Not just metal, but everything you associate with metal. Everything you agreed to when you first put them on. I'd worn these in Mosul and in Kandahar. I'd worn them in places where the definition of danger was less ambiguous than a backyard in June. I'd come home from all of that. I'd built the house, married Denise, raised the kids, cooked the ribs, strung the lights in the oak trees. I put the dog tags back against my chest and picked up my phone and called Calvin. He answered on the second ring. "I've been up," he said before I could say anything. "I've been looking?" "Me too," I said. "This isn't the first time," Calvin said. "I know," I said. "What do we do with it?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet I could hear him thinking, sorting through the options the way he'd always done, even when we were kids, methodically, without drama. "You need a real attorney," he said. "Not me. Someone who can file a civil rights claim and make it stick. I know a guy in D.C., Karen Osei's firm. She's handled 4 cases like this in the last 3 years. 2 went federal." "Call her in the morning," I said. "Marcus?" "Yeah. The video has 600,000 views," he said. "This is already something else." I looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was dark and still. The folding tables collapsed and leaned against the fence. The lights in the oak trees powered down, the grill covered in cold. The balloons were still there, tied to the fence posts, yellow and white and blue, barely visible in the pre-dawn dark. "I know," I said. "Good. I didn't sleep after that." I made a second cup of coffee, and I sat and I waited for morning with the quiet focus of a man who has decided what he is going to do. Karen Osei arrived from D.C. 2 days later. She was 51 years old, small, precise, with close-cut natural hair and reading glasses she pushed up onto her forehead and then lowered and pushed up again in a rhythm that I quickly understood meant she was thinking. She sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and went through everything. Rochelle's video, the incident report, the Facebook post about Diane Morton, the community board thread about Robert Ellison, and a complaint I hadn't known about, a third one, that her paralegal had turned up in a different county's records overnight. 4 incidents, she said, tapping the pad with her pen. Same officer, same pattern. Noise complaint, black homeowner, detention without cause, release without charges, 4 times in 31 months. "What does that give us?" I asked. She looked at me over the reading glasses. "It gives us a pattern," she said. "And a pattern is a policy. And a policy means the department isn't just vicariously liable. It's directly liable. This isn't a rogue officer. This is a practice." Denise made more coffee. Aaliyah sat at the far end of the table, quiet and very still, listening. She was supposed to start her first job in Atlanta in 3 weeks. She had a position at a non-profit doing housing rights work, which felt, in that moment, like something that had been arranging itself for years, without any of us knowing. What about Garland? I asked. Karen looked at her pad. Your neighbor. He called it in. I'm sure of it. And I don't think it was the first time he's made that kind of call. I told her about the basketball hoop, about the window watching, about the expression on his face at the fence. I want to know if there's a record. She nodded slowly. We can pull the 911 call logs for this address and the surrounding properties going back to your move-in date. If he's been making pattern calls, it'll show. It showed. Ted Garland had called 911 9 times in 6 years. 3 of those calls referenced our property specifically. Once about the basketball hoop, once about loud music, once about suspicious activity, which turned out to be Jordan teaching a friend to ride a bike in the driveway. 4 other calls referenced the Washingtons 3 doors down. 2 referenced a family on the next block that had moved in 2 years ago. The Washingtons were black. The family on the next block was black. We were black. The 3 white families on our street had no 911 calls associated with them in Garland's history. Karen looked at that spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. Then she said, harassment. Documented, patterned, racially motivated harassment using emergency services as a weapon. She paused. This is a second cause of action. The press conference was Calvin's idea. He'd been talking to Terrence, who'd been talking to some people he knew through veterans organizations, and by the time the conference was set for Thursday, 6 days after the BBQ, there were 3 other affected families who had agreed to stand up. Diane Morton, Robert Ellison, a man named Curtis Banks, who'd had a similar encounter 2 years ago and filed the complaint that Price himself had later reviewed and dismissed. I had one request for Karen going into Thursday. When I speak, I said, I want to read the service record. She tilted her head. Yours? Mine and Price's, I said, side by side. She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, small and sharp and satisfied, the way you smile when someone hands you exactly the right tool for the job. I'll have it ready, she said. The conference room was at Karen's firm. 12 reporters, 2 camera crews, a local TV anchor, and a journalist from a national outlet who'd flown in after the video crossed 2 million views. Calvin stood to my left, Denise to my right. Aaliyah was in the front row. Terrence stood against the back wall with his arms folded. I read my service record first. 26 years, 2 combat deployments. Iraq, 2004 to 2005. Afghanistan, 2010 to 2011. 4 commendations. The Bronze Star. I left out because I didn't want it to be about the medal. It was about the service, about the years, about what they represent. Then I read Price's record. 9 years on the force, 2 excessive force complaints, both dismissed. 1 suspension overturned on appeal, no commendations. I set down both sheets of paper. I'm not telling you this story because I want to be thanked for my service, I said. I'm telling it because the same country that gave me a medal for my service then allowed its officer to put handcuffs on me in my own backyard in front of my daughter's graduation party for no legal reason. I am not asking for gratitude. I am asking for consistency. If this country means what it says, then it means it for everyone. And if it doesn't mean it for everyone, then we have more work to do. The room was quiet. Then the reporter from the national outlet raised his hand. Price was put on administrative leave 4 days after the press conference. He was terminated from the force 14 weeks later, following a departmental review that, thanks to Karen's civil rights filing and the pattern documentation, expanded into an investigation of 11 separate incidents over Price's career. 6 of those incidents resulted in formal findings against him. The city settled our civil case 8 months later for a figure I'm not allowed to disclose under the terms of the agreement, except to say that it was enough to pay off the mortgage on the house where my daughter's graduation balloons were still tied to the fence posts. Ted Garland listed his house for sale in September. I don't know exactly what pushed him to it. The news coverage, the documentation of his 911 history that Karen had entered into the public record, or something more private. Some version of himself he could no longer maintain in the neighborhood he'd tried to curate. What I do know is that on the day the for sale sign went up, the Washingtons 3 doors down had a cookout of their own, and they invited us, and we went. There is a particular afternoon I returned to in the months that followed. It was a Sunday in November, gray and cold, the oak trees bare. I was standing on the back porch with my coffee, Black, no sugar, same as always. And Denise came out and tucked herself under my arm the way she does, and we stood looking at the backyard. The lights were down, the tables were inside, the grill was covered for winter, the fence posts where the balloons had been tied were bare and weathered. "You know what Aaliyah said to me?" Denise asked. "What?" "She said this whole thing is why she does what she does. She said she understood it in theory before. Now she understands it in her body." I thought about that for a long time. About the things you carry without knowing you're carrying them, and the things you put down. About the cold metal weight of dog tags against a sternum in a backyard in June, when the charcoal was still hot and the smoke ring on the ribs was exactly right and the world was supposed to be soft and golden and full of people you love. I reached up and pulled the dog tags out, held them for a second in my palm, the familiar heft of them, the stamped letters, the worn edges of 20-some years. Then I tucked them back. I always told my kids this country was worth fighting for. Standing on that porch in November, coffee in hand, Denise warm against my side, Aaliyah in Atlanta fighting for people's right to stay in their homes. I still believe that. But now I knew something I hadn't known as clearly before. Worth fighting for doesn't mean it fights for you. Sometimes you have to make it. Sometimes you have to stand completely still, handcuffed at your own grill, and trust that the people who love you have their phones out. And then, when the cuffs come off, you finish cooking.